Hello and welcome to the 6th installment of my review of Netflix Sandman. If you missed any of the previous installments, I will have links down below for your convenience. With that out of the way, let us begin. Episode 6, The Sound of Her Wings. This episode is an amalgamation of Issue 8 and Issue 13 from the comic. Morpheus sits brooding on a park bench feeding the pigeons, when a football is about to hit him. He catches it, and we meet race-swapped character number 9, Franklin. He compliments Morpheus on his catch and offers him to join their game, but Morpheus declines. As Franklin turns to leave, we meet race-swapped character number 10, Death. Let us pause the review here and discuss this now. Death is the most controversial race-swapped character in the show. When the promotional casting chart was released, there was instant backlash to the casting. Is the backlash fair? In my opinion, yes. The character was created as a young and very pale goth girl, with a cheerful attitude. The show version, the character is now a bit older, black woman, that wears black clothes, and has a cheerful attitude. We will compare the two later, and focus only on the controversy. As we have already come across many race-swapped characters so far in the show, running into another one should be commonplace. In part, it is, but Death is no throwaway character. She is endless. Dream's sister. The character had 2 spin-off miniseries. A bunch of merchandise created in her image, including posters, t-shirts, watches and action figures. Just for context, there are none of those for Rosemary, or Paul, or even Unity Kincaid. And they were all white in the comics. So now you understand popularity of the character, and now I hope you understand the fan backlash makes sense. So now the question is, the fan backlash warranted? Is there a reason to be upset that the character is race-swapped? From a character perspective, no. Death can look like anybody, or even a skeleton. So of course, Death can have the appearance of a black woman. With that said, Death in the Sandman was not black. It really is as simple as that. The casting of a black woman is jarring at the very least. To be fair, when Scarlett Johansson was cast as Major Kusanagi in Ghost in the Shell, fans were outraged at the whitewashing of the character. In this instance, if Scarlett Johansson isn't cast in the lead, the movie does not get made. Is it the same situation in the Sandman? No. There was no outrage from Scarlett Johansson, or the director, or the producers of the movie when fans complained about the whitewash casting. Yet in this case, there was. Neil Gaiman went front and center to defend the casting. He tweeted back in response to many tweets stating that people were complaining superficially, and had not read the comic. He also tweeted this. I give all the fucks about the work. I spent 30 years successfully battling bad movies of Sandman. I give zero fucks about people who don't understand / haven't read Sandman whining about a non-binary desire or that Death isn't white enough. Watch the show, make up your minds. In regards to this tweet, I believe that Neil does give all the fucks about his work. I do know there have been many Sandman scripts for adaptation that never panned out due to one reason or another. And yes, I believe Neil gives zero fucks about people complaining that have not read Sandman. So I believe Neil's tweet is truthful, and he is a bit frustrated. In regards to my opinion here in this review, let me state again that I have read the source material, and I am a Neil Gaiman fan. I am not ignorant to the source material. So now I am sure you are all waiting with bated breath to know what I think of the casting choice. As a fan of Neil, and as a person that read the comic, I do not approve of the casting. I have already pointed out the other race-swapped characters, and have shown it is not necessarily the race-swapping that is the issue, but the change in characterizations in order to continue propagating the woke narrative. The other question to ask is, why did they not race-swap any of the other endless characters? If Death can be anything, then surely Desire and Despair could also be anything. Does it have anything to do with Desire being a scheming antagonist, and Despair being fat and ugly? I would say yes, and it does follow the woke narrative. So, did Neil sell out? As a fan and still one now, the answer is yes, and no. Neil is the creator of Sandman and everything about it. It is a rich tapestry weaving in Greek and Norse mythology, Eastern and Egyptian gods, with Shakespeare and 80s and 90s British zeitgeist. Nothing will ever change what Neil created. But he does not own it. DC Comics owns Sandman, and DC can do whatever the hell they want to without Neil's blessing. The showrunners did come to him, and made him an EP of the show. I don't know how much weight he had in regards to casting choices or even creative choices in the show, but even if Neil was a hard ass, the showrunners are woke as hell, and they were going to make the woke choices regardless. Yes, Neil could have been that Ayn Rand asshole of my way or no way, and denounced the show stating he wants nothing to do with it, a la Alan Moore. Would that have changed anything? In regards to the show, no. In regards to Neil, I'd respect him more, just like I do for Alan Moore, Steve Ditko, and Bill Watterson. With that said, ask yourself if you can refuse a huge payday to something that you created, but are powerless to affect. And if you stayed on, at the very least you might have some say in guiding your work to be decent, rather than an outright abomination. It is hard to not be a sellout, and I do not know his financial situation. I do not know if he even receives any royalties for Sandman reprints. As a fan of Neil, I do not have an issue with him cashing out to something he created. I also do not expect an adaptation to be 100% faithful to the source material. However, I do have a major issue with the absolute raping of Morpheus's character. He is a beta male. Underlings constantly defy his orders. He is dependent and reliant on them, rather than being the alpha male, stoic, wise, and cunning person that he is in the source material. That is totally unacceptable, and yes, in regards to this, I am extremely disappointed in Neil for this portrayal. If he cares about his work, he should have cared about the portrayal of his title character more, rather than the story just touching all the beats of the source material. As a Neil fan, it gives me no joy to express my disappointment in his involvement of the show. With that said, and me having read the source material, perhaps Neil may still give zero fucks about my opinion, and that is his choice. However, as a real fan, how can Neil give all the fucks about his work, and dismiss the issues I have highlighted in regards to the source material? Now back to the episode. Death sits next to Morpheus and asks him how is he. Morpheus goes on a brooding diatribe of how he felt. Angered with revenge in his heart, and reacquiring all his tools, he now feels empty and aimless. With Morpheus finished, Death berates him, telling him he is wallowing in self-pity, rather than pushing forward to find meaning in his life. Death catches the errand football heading her way, and tells Morpheus she has work, and he can accompany her in the meantime. Franklin asks Death if they could meet up, and Death tells him they will soon. So they continue chatting and Morpheus accompanies Death as she does her rounds. To summarize, Death visits people, a senior, a baby, and a young bloke, and tells them their time is up, and collects their souls. She collects their souls, but that is it. She is not their judge, nor does she decide where their soul's destination is. She is just there to collect them from the waking world. As she does this, Morpheus tags along, seeing her perform her duties as an endless, and it gives him renewed interest in doing his job to the best of his abilities. They finally part back at the park they met at, and Death collects her lost soul, Franklin, they met earlier. After they part, Morpheus makes his way to an old fenced-off building. He looks at it and we get a time jump back to 1389. The same building is in front of him, and Morpheus and Death enter to find a busy tavern. Why they are there? To meet people, but Death is cheerful at being there, and Morpheus is extremely reluctant. They walk through the tavern, seeing people talking about their issues, and telling their stories. Upon walking through the tavern, they overhear a person, Hobgatling, talking about Death, and that Death is stupid. This pricks their interests, and they listen in on their conversation. Morpheus comments why anybody would not want to die and live in this hellhole. Death says to him that he could find out, and grant his wish. Morpheus says he will be begging to die within a century, but Death says it will be interesting to find out. She asks him if she should tell him or will he. Morpheus says he will. He goes up to him and says he overheard him of not dying. The man says yes, and Morpheus tells him, "You must tell me what it is like," and sets a date of 100 years to meet in the same tavern. Hobgatling agrees, and Morpheus departs. 100 years later in the same tavern, Hobgatling and Morpheus are sitting at a table. Hob questions Morpheus who he is, and why he is still alive. Morpheus says he is not the devil, and he is interested in his experiences. He can choose his life as he sees fit, and he just wants to know what it is like. Hob says life is brilliant, much to the amazement of Morpheus. He states some minor technological improvements that Morpheus finds unimpressive, and then asks what he has been doing during the past 100 years. Hob tells him mostly soldiering, and a little bit of banditry, but he is getting into the printing business, and with that, Morpheus departs until their next meeting. Another 100 years have passed, and Morpheus passes by a conversation of Shakespeare and Marlowe, when Hob calls him to his table. Hob is successful, dressed well with a feast laid out on the table. He has been knighted, and goes by Sir Robert Gadling. He shows Morpheus a picture of his wife and son, which he is proud of. Shakespeare, speaking loudly, grabs Morpheus's attention, and he asks Hob who is he. He tells him that is Shakespeare, and that he writes plays. Morpheus asks if he is any good, and Hob says no, but the other guy is. Morpheus leaves Hob more interested in Shakespeare, and the two talk. Another 100 years pass, and Morpheus is still alone waiting when Hob bursts into the tavern looking disheveled and starving. Hob tells Morpheus that all of his previous successes are now gone. His land, gold, and wife are all gone. His wife died in childbirth along with a child, and his son died when he was 20. He was tried as a witch, and was imprisoned for 40 years. Hob says he hated every second of the last 80 years, and Morpheus asks if he still wants to live. Hob replies of course, and he still has so much to live for. On the second floor, a man is spying their meeting, and draws them. Another 100 years have passed, and we see a lady along with two of her cohorts looking at the drawing done 100 years ago. They enter the tavern. Hob and Morpheus sit in the tavern in a private room away from the other patrons. Hob tells Morpheus that he is in the shipping business, and part of the triangular trade. Morpheus tells Hob, slavery is not right, and he should choose a different line of work. Hob throws his advice back in his face saying what happened to him choosing his own path. Morpheus says the choice is still his, but would he take that choice away from others? Hob replies that he will reconsider. Hob talks about Shakespeare, and that he turned out to be a decent playwright. He then asks if he made a deal with him. Morpheus gives him a cryptic answer, and Hob tells him all of this time and he does not know anything about him. Who he is. What is his name? Before Morpheus can reply, they are interrupted by Lady Joanna Constantine and her two cohorts. She tells them why she is here due to a rumor that the devil and a wandering Jew meet here every 100 years, and she wants to know their secrets. Both of them refuse to humor her order, and her two cohorts step up to them and threaten them at knife point. Hob incapacitates both of them, and Lady Constantine pulls a knife at Hob, when Morpheus stands, and blows sand into her face. Hob asks what he did to her, and Morpheus says he has reacquainted her with some old ghosts in her life. Morpheus also states he needed no help from Hob, which Hob realizes. Morpheus warns Hob to be cautious, and they part to meet in 100 years. Morpheus is stopped at the entrance of the pub by a prostitute when Hob comes to greet Morpheus. They step in talking about her, and Morpheus tells him her entire story. Hob is amazed that he knows everybody, and people are not what they seem except for him. He is still the same. Morpheus tells Hob he has changed, but Hob says he still makes the same mistakes. He thinks it is Morpheus that has changed, and Morpheus asks how. Hob tells him after all of these years, Morpheus is not interested in his experiences anymore, and wants to know if he is ready to die, but rather comes century after century because he is lonely. Morpheus grows angry, and tells Hob if he really thinks he requires his companionship, and Hob says yes. Morpheus rises from his seat, and leaves to prove him wrong. Morpheus storms out of the pub, and Hob chases after him telling him where he'll be in 100 years, and if Morpheus shows up, it will be because they are friends and no other reason. 100 years pass, and Hob waits in the pub alone. He waits all day long, and blames himself for the way they parted last. It is revealed that Morpheus was imprisoned during this time, and was unable to make their scheduled meeting. Now back to present day, Morpheus stands outside the abandoned pub with the new pub directions spray painted on the fencing. Morpheus follows the directions, and enters the new pub to see Hob doing some paperwork. He looks up and sees Morpheus, and smiles telling him he is late, and Morpheus replies it is unwise to keep one's friends waiting. We then get a flyby of Desire's realm, the threshold, and she talks to Despair's Sigil. He says Morpheus is free, but she has a new plan waiting for him. This concludes episode 6. Before we begin the review of this segment, let me just acknowledge the anachronistic woke cast choices. I did not count them as race-swapped characters as they are very minor. Being that we are going back in time, seeing black people in Europe with positions of status is jarring to say the least. However, like the show Bridgerton, the showrunners could not care less about authenticity or shameless displays of anachronisms. Let us review the first part. The story arc of Death doing her rounds is accurate. The portrayal of Death as a character is accurate. The issues that I have is the look. The day is nice, and there is too much color. The look of the episode does not feel like a Sandman comic, but rather a romance show. I am not asking for a gloomy day, or rain, but a few notches lower than a bright and sunny day. As for the actor playing Death, they supposedly auditioned hundreds of actors for the role. If that means hundreds of black actors, I do not know. Overall, she is okay. Nothing special. Nothing memorable. The biggest issue with her is her reply to Morpheus. She lectures him, but she does not emote her disappointment and anger well. It does not come across as sharp as either the audio version or the comic. In both cases, the comic and the audio version are limited, while the show has both audio and visual. Yet, the other two are far superior in conveying this scene. That could be the fault of the director, so I cannot blame her completely. Whatever the reason, it was clearly a missed opportunity. If they did audition hundreds of actors, and this is the best person they found, then in my opinion, it is clear the role was race-swapped before the auditions. In context, the role of Death went to Kat Dennings in the audio version. I personally think her voice is grating, and her voice acting is not very good, but the contrast in choices for the role makes a stark comparison. Now the Hobgatling Storyline. This story arc is the highlight of the entire show. It is accurate to the comic, and I am sure the showrunners were trying to find a loophole in casting Hob as a black man, but to the show's benefit, they failed. I find Hobgatling as the closest person that we, the audience, can relate to in having a relationship with Morpheus. He is also a representation of hope and perseverance, living through the bad times, and still holding on to the thrill of life. Of course, it is not all roses with this story arc. We do get the impossible girl again, but this time, she is the real Lady Constantine. Apparently, she smirked a lot too, but at least it is relatively short. So what is my rating? Without any source material, I'd give it a 7. I think the first part with Death was too drawn out. Again, the first part feels very out of place. It does not look like a Sandman episode, and it definitely does not feel like the source material at all. However, Hobgatling story is interesting, and well done. With the source material, it gets a 5. Black Death is forgettable. She brings nothing worthy of note to the character, and clearly the showrunners intended to cast Death as a black woman for the very beginning. The entire mood is wrong, and I give all points towards the Hobgatling story arc. This concludes the Preludes and Nocturnes story arc. The next episode begins a new story arc. If I had to grade this story arc as a whole, I would assign it a 3. Like all shows, it begins with curiosity. As the show progresses, one normally becomes engrossed in the story and characters. Unfortunately, I could never get into either, due to the wokeness constantly interjecting itself into the story, and sacrificing characters in exchange for promulgating the woke narrative. In this story arc, we did get only a limited amount of Lucian. It pains me to say, we will get much more of her, as well as Matthew, as well as a plethora of new insufferable characters. Of course, all shows have insufferable characters you love to hate. In this instance, the insufferable characters are the so-called heroes of the show.
Fucking hell.
This concludes the review of episode 6. As always, thank you for watching, and I hope to see you here on our next installment. Until then, have a nice day, and take care.